Are you confident the elections are going to be run fairly? Well, if you're like most Americans in this Pew Research poll, you have questions, you have doubts, and guess what? Maybe you should. Election integrity, that is the topic of today's discussion. And I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. Listen to this headline. Pew Research Center just conducted this poll, and in their press release, they write, 2 years after election turmoil, GOP voters remain skeptical on elections and vote counts. Are you among those? Are you among the doubters, the doubting Thomases about election counts? Sharp decline in share of Republican voters who are, quote, very confident, end quote, that votes cast at polling places will be counted accurately. I have questions. I still have questions about the previous presidential election, and that sends up red flags to these midterms that we're just about to kick off. Actually, we don't have election day anymore in this country. We have election month, election couple of months. It seems like it's trending toward, and that's alarming in itself. So the midterms have already actually kicked off with early voting and mail-in balloting. But as far as election day goes, we're just around the corner from it, and too many Americans still have doubts about the election turnout of the last presidential contest and about this current ongoing election. Sad, very sad, a country like America turning into a banana republic right before our eyes. Before I get into more of this, I want to quickly mention, if you like Bold and Blunt, you can get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, the online platform for faith-based podcasts, at washingtontimes.com, where you can also subscribe to Bold and Blunt, so you get it delivered right to your email box. Why search for it when you can just get it handed to you on a silver email platter? Just go to washingtontimes.com, find my name. It's on the webpage. It's on the webpage frequently because I write commentaries all day long at the Washington Times. Click on one of my commentaries, scroll to the bottom of it, and you will find some easy directions on how to sign up for my 3 times a week newsletter. Comes out Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Within each newsletter are my commentaries for that day so far, along with my twice weekly Tuesdays and Thursdays Bold and Blunt podcast. So that's the peasiest way to get Bold and Blunt, but you can get Bold and Blunt wherever podcasts are offered. So let's talk about election integrity. This national survey conducted October 10th through 16th among 5,098 U.S. adults, 3,993 of whom were classified as registered voters. Okay, 56% majority of registered voters who support Republican candidates for Congress say they think the midterm elections in the United States will be administered very or somewhat well. So that's somewhat optimistic. It's not very optimistic, a little over half, but that's up by 6 percentage points from 2020, when only 50% thought that the elections would be administered well or somewhat well, very, very well or somewhat well. Okay, so let's look at the key findings from this report. The bullet points. Republican voters remain skeptical of absentee and mail voting and are now less confident that votes cast in person will be counted accurately. Well, you should be skeptical of mail-in balloting and early voting. Why shouldn't you be? Because the longer you stretch out election day, the more opportunity for those with nefarious agendas to commit their nefarious acts. The more chance for fraud. You want election day where people line up to go to the polls and they drop into the box their paper ballots that have to be counted then by hand and then reported. You don't want all this electronic voting mail-in balloting, early voting, or just somebody gets it in their mind, oh, I think I'll vote. Yeah, I'll vote. Go ahead. I don't know who's running, but you know what? This name sounds good. Or I think that's the Republican candidate. Not sure. Maybe I'll vote. What difference does it make? It's just one vote. You want people taking their voting seriously, especially women. Come on now. It was a hard-fought win to get the vote. If you can't at least have some research or general ideas about the principles of the candidates for whom you vote, then just stay home. You're not doing women as a class, as a gender any favors, and you're not doing America any favors by voting out of ignorance. Anyhow, Republican voters remain skeptical. The numbers, nearly 8 in 10 voters who back Republican congressional candidates, and by 8 in 10 they mean 79%, say they are very or somewhat confident that votes cast in person will be counted accurately. See, that's a decent number. Only 26% say they are very confident, but by and large, counting ballots in person emboldens confidence, right? Because it's a lot harder when you got to sit there and go through a stack of paper ballots. It's a lot harder to commit acts of fraud. It's harder to get by with fraud. There are too many people watching and doing recounts and double checking the counts. Democrats, of course, are overwhelmingly confident in-person votes will be counted accurately and have become, this is interesting, more confident in absentee and mail voting. You know why? Because that's what they've been pushing for so many years. The coronavirus was their greatest gift to voting. Democrats wanted everybody staying at home. Everybody staying at home and just filling out their ballots and mailing them in, or better yet, give them to Nancy Pelosi to count. Give them to that friendly Democrat neighbor to carry off down to the local ballot counting station. No worries there. Nothing to see, nothing to worry about. Democrats wanted everybody staying at home voting, and if they could get by with it this year, this term, this election cycle, they certainly would. If they could drum up enough fears about the coronavirus to keep everybody home for yet just one more election cycle, these midterms, they certainly would. But, alas, their plans have gone awry. Republican voters who have positive views of Donald Trump have less confidence in midterm election administration, accurate vote counts, than do GOP voters with neutral or negative views. Why do they have to drag Donald Trump into this? Why does it always have to be a special class in America called Donald Trump voters, MAGA supporters? The ones who want to kill democracy if you listen to Joe Biden's speech. If you can understand Joe Biden when he speaks. That's kind of what he's trying to get at. Anybody who supported Donald Trump is a deplorable, as Hillary Clinton put it. And worse than that, a racist. A racist who wants to kill old people, get old people, GOP. Remember that? Remember that? Democrat, I think he was from Florida. I forget what his name was, but his big claim to fame was turning GOP into that tagline, get old people. Anyhow, one more bullet point about this survey. And this one's a laughable one. Democratic voters are far more likely than Republican voters to say it is, quote, very important, end quote, for losing congressional candidates to concede. Really? Calling Stacey Abrams, please, who still hasn't conceded the last election for governor in Georgia. But look, the devil's in the details on this one, right? Here's how Democrats skip over truth when asked that question. Democratic voters are far more likely than Republican voters to say it is very important for losing congressional candidates to concede. So Democrats simply make the case, when they refuse to concede, that they haven't lost. Their candidate hasn't lost. It's not that they don't want to concede. It's just that they haven't lost. So why should they concede? And of course, if Republicans make that same point, then Republicans, as Hillary Clinton has said, are just simply stealing elections. It's bogus. It's bogus how the media treat Republicans versus Democrats, especially at election time. Media and most pollsters, how they go after Republicans and how they artificially inflate the numbers and chances of Democrat candidates, while meanwhile artificially deflating the numbers and chances of Republican candidates. And it all goes back to election integrity, right? Because you've got the lead up to the elections where the media is doing its big job of carrying water for all the Democrat candidates. You've got the Democrats lying about the Republicans, and then all the low information, zero information voters that the Democrats count on in their elections, carrying forth the lies about the Republicans on social media, which up until just recently, and Elon Musk coming into the fray, was completely controlled by the far left. And so you have that atmosphere of hysteria. And then you finally have Election Day, or as we've come to know it in this country, Election Month, with the mail-in balloting, with the early voting and so forth. So it's no wonder that many Americans have questions about the electoral process and whether votes indeed are being properly counted. And my guest today has had so many questions that not only has he had to make a film about it, but he has now written a book about it as well. Dinesh D'Souza, best-selling author, award-winning filmmaker. You can check out his broadcasts at Salem News Channel. The website for that is just salemnewschannel.com. And now he has a new book out just in time for this also crucial election, midterm elections. 2,000 mules. They thought we'd never find out. They were wrong. Dinesh, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
So I want to talk about your 2,000 mules. They thought we'd never find out. They were wrong, which is a great title. But before we get into that, because I know it's being hit by controversy, same as the film, I just wanted to speak generically about elections in general. We're headed into the midterms. Based on your research, what should American voters keep an eye out for in terms of red flags on election fraud?
Well, I think the big one that relates to my work and the work of True the Vote and 2,000 Mules is simply the issue of surveillance of mail-in drop boxes. Now, in asking for 24-hour surveillance of these drop boxes, we're doing nothing more than asking for something that is already in the election guidelines, in the election rules. So if you look up the CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, they say every drop box should have surveillance. Even Mark Zuckerberg, when he put all that money into the 2020 election, his contracts called for electronic surveillance, and yet many drop boxes, in fact most, did not have surveillance in 2020. So that's an issue I think that Republicans can emphasize. And in some cases where there's no surveillance, patriots are sort of taking it, into their own hands and saying, okay, well, we'll camp out of the drop box and we'll take a look and make sure no mules show up.
Now, a lot of states in the months since the 2020 election have tightened up their election laws. Are you satisfied with the direction states are taking?
Well, I think the movement has been in a good direction. Certainly the emphasis on voter ID is important, on signature matching. That's important. There have been some states that have outlawed this massive infusion of private money of the kind that Zuckerberg put in 2020, although I don't believe he's doing it in 2022. I mean, when it happened in 2020, people were taken by surprise. In fact, I tried to find out if Zuckerberg was breaking the law, and I couldn't find any laws that he was. I don't think anyone envisioned that somebody with that kind of cash would be dictating to cities and to counties and to states, look, I want so many drop boxes, I want them over here, I want my left-wing activists to come inside your office and help administer the election. I mean, who even thought, who would think somebody would have the chutzpah to do that?
So when you looked into election laws and election fraud and so forth, and you created 2000 Mules, the film, and now your book, 2000 Mules, what were some of the most eyebrow-raising instances of fraud that you found that weren't attacked immediately?
Well, the reason for the attacks, I should say, is simply the fact that this is a film and a book that goes against probably the biggest orthodoxy on the left, which is that this was the most secure election in history. Now, that dogma, when it was first advanced, was never supported. If someone were to say this is the most secure anything, you would think they'd produce a comparison showing there was, in this case, less fraud in 2020 than there was in 2016, 2012, 2008, and going back. But no one's even done that. So from the beginning, this was a dubious proposition, dogmatically advanced, and protected by a citadel of censorship. So if you questioned it, you're a big liar, you're an election denier, etc. And so the movie sort of shows up, and it provides something that I think conservatives and Republicans have been looking for, which is some real evidence. In other words, not just suspicions, anomalies, I've got a woman, here with 50 affidavits. We don't know who those are from, and if those people can be believed. I didn't want to make a movie with that kind of stuff. And so it wasn't until I saw evidence, and here we're talking about two separate lines of evidence, cell phone geo-tracking on the one hand, and surveillance video on the other. And I think what's powerful is the two corroborate each other. Now, I want to emphasize with the surveillance video, we're talking about the official surveillance video of the states themselves. And this was taken in the weeks leading up to the 2020 election, and yet evidently no one looked at it. So the video footage in the movie came as a shock, because although the footage was there, the states actually had it. They were apparently too lazy to review it, and it took a small Texas organization, True the Vote, to do the heavy lifting of just going through that footage and producing it a year and a half later for the first time.
Is it your view that there was enough election fraud committed in the 2020 election that it swung wrongfully to Joe Biden's side, that Donald Trump, in fact, should be president? Is that your viewpoint?
That is my viewpoint. It is a viewpoint that is kind of approached in a very circumspect way, and I say that because the film, if you've watched 2000 Mules, Trump is not a major figure in the film. In fact, he barely appears in it. In 90 minutes of the movie, he's in it for maybe 2 minutes, and it's typically just clips of him when he was campaigning and so on, because I didn't want this to be about Trump. But I also thought, listen, if you're going to make a film, you're going to talk about fraud, you need to sort of do the math and estimate the volume of fraud and look to see if it would have been enough to tip these key states. So we use kind of two different calculuses. You could call it the hyper-conservative calculus and then the more sort of broad calculus to estimate how things would have changed. But yes, I think that if this fraud is subtracted, Trump would have won the election.
Wow, that's a very bold stance at this point in time, when others who believe similarly have been sort of silenced because their voices are being deplatformed.
Right, and I think the reason for the deplatforming and so on is because this is, true, there's been some irresponsible rhetoric about the election, and people claim to know things that they can't possibly know, and I've seen claims about machine swapping votes and so on, and yet I've never seen anybody open up a machine and show me that can be done and in fact was done. So what I do in this film and in the book is I don't try to adjudicate, the varied claims of fraud. I just focus on the one that I know something about, where there's been very good work and very good empirical work. And the good thing about 2000 Mules is it's sort of like a scientific hypothesis with a lot of evidence, and the evidence is open to public review. So we say there are these 2,000 mules. They've been going to drop boxes, at least 10 drop boxes each. They've been stuffing ballots, and we have their cell phone IDs. Now, any law enforcement agency can say, all right, let's see if Dinesh is right. we're going to take these cell phone IDs, we're going to go to a court, get a warrant, interview the mules, and maybe the mules will say, oh no, this is completely innocent. These were, I've got 17 members of my family. I don't like to put all the ballots in one box, so I went to 10 different boxes. Whatever the explanation is, and I would be proven wrong. So I'm perfectly happy to submit my data, if you will, to checking. It's the left that doesn't want that to happen, and that's why they're screaming, nothing needs to happen, we just need to stop talking about all this. They're scared of the truth.
Well, Regnery, your own publisher, was a little bit hesitant because they initially recalled your book, and I'd like you to talk about that because I don't know the specifics. And then now, apparently, there's someone who's trying to sue you over claims you made in your book, which is probably expected. I'm sure you anticipated that. But if you could talk about those two issues for a minute.
For sure. In the case of Regnery and the recall, something very weird happened that, as someone who knows about books, you'll recognize. All books undergo a legal review.
Yes.
And so when I send in my book, I typically do this. I mean, this is like my 18th book, so I was like, okay, the legal review will occur. Typically, they come back with a few questions, or they say, we don't want you to say this, or we don't want you to say that. But nothing happened like that. And then on the eve of publication, the lawyers weigh in and go, wait a minute. And so I'm like, what? So evidently there was some kind of, I don't know what, but on the publisher's side, not on my side. So the legal department wanted to make some changes, but came in at the last minute. The book was already being printed, and so that was the reason for the recall. The standard legal review that should have happened prior evidently didn't occur. Regnery took responsibility for the mistake. So it's not that I goofed or I did anything that was somehow reprehensible. None of that. This was a case of an internal error at Regnery that was fixed in the way that they decided to fix it.
And the lawsuit that has already kicked off over your book, are you worried about that at all, or is this what you expected?
Yeah, let's just say I'm not worried about it at all. But it is one guy who is shown in the video, in the film, and he's shown stuffing ballots into the box. You can count at least 5 going in the box. Now, we did take a legal precaution in the film that, again, we're required to do when films get insurance. They need legal clearance. We blurred the faces of all the mules. So the fact of it, and we went to such an extent that, by the way, at one point there's a mule showing up with a dog, and we blurred the face of the dog. So the dog itself is a kind of a blob. So the point here being that this is something really for law enforcement. We didn't think it's our job to sort of, quote, out the mules. But nevertheless, this guy who's sort of outing himself is saying, hey, that's me, and, I'm being maligned here. And so that's really what the lawsuit is all about. I can't go, obviously, because it's a legal matter. I won't go into the details of it, but I'm not losing any sleep over it.
How do we get to the point in America? Now, I know historically there have been proven instances of election fraud and so forth, particularly in Chicago. But how do we get to the point in this country where ballot stuffing becomes an actual thing?
Well, the problem is that this is a very common type of fraud, but in the past it affected a very tiny portion of the overall election. I have a little section. One thing you can do in a book you can't do in a film is do a little bit of history. So in 1864, the Democrats organized an election fraud campaign, believe it or not, involving mail-in ballots to steal the election from Abraham Lincoln. Now, why did they need the mail-in ballots? Because the soldiers were all on the battlefield and they couldn't come home and vote, so they voted by mail. Democrats figured out how to intercept those mails, basically either vote the votes of soldiers who hadn't voted or take the ballots of soldiers who sent in mail-in ballots and change them away from Lincoln and toward McClellan, the Democratic candidate. The scheme was busted. So this is 1864. And the difference is that, in the early part of it, in the 19th century, and then in most of the 20th century, mail-in ballots and absentee ballots were a small fraction of the overall election. So even though a lot of cheating went on there, it didn't make that much of a difference. But now, with 2020, with COVID, with mail-in ballots being 30-40% of the overall vote, the opportunities for fraud have just multiplied.
And that's exactly how we counter this, right? We need to get back to the days where the only mail-in ballots or early voting are from the military or those with serious health issues. Do you agree?
I agree completely. I mean, I recognize that in an environment where states make their own laws, we're going to have most likely a diversity of rules. So you're not going to get a one-size-fits-all. So in principle, I agree, but I also think that in cases where you do have mail-in drop boxes, it's really important to have transparency, checks on those, and most certainly surveillance.
I always find it a little bit interesting that Republicans are so quiet on this issue, because I remember before Donald Trump was even elected, he was talking about the need to clean up the electoral process, and he was being shushed by members of his own party. And I wonder, I'd like to get your response on this. Do Republicans not want to rock the boat because they're afraid if they dig too deep, it will completely blow up America's electoral system? Or are they part and parcel of the fraud themselves?
Very good question, and I have two answers to it. I think the first one is that customarily Republicans focus on campaigns and Democrats on elections. So Democrats don't just campaign, they focus on things like, well, where are those drop boxes going to be located? And who's going to be opening up the envelopes and looking at the ballots? And, you know, if a vote is ambiguous with, let's say, a check mark for Biden and a smudge for Trump, who decides what happens to that ballot? Is it counted? Is it not counted? What if somebody forgets to put their address? You know, Democrats pay excruciating attention to this kind of thing. Republicans ignore it. And me too. I mean, for decades, I'd walk in to pull the curtain, you know, cast my ballot, and kind of assume the system would take care of everything else. And it's only now, I think, that Republicans are waking up to the fact that, wait a minute, we got to pay attention to the campaign, but we also got to pay attention to the election. The other factor, which is a little more insidious, is I do think that there are members of the Republican establishment who are not dissatisfied with the result of the 2020 election. They're actually happy that Republicans down ballot did pretty well, and they're also happy that Trump lost. So their view is, okay, let Biden come in. He'll be horrible. There'll be a public revolt. People will throw the Democrats out, and the Republicans will be swept back in, but without Trump. And this is really why 2000 Mules, both the book and the movie, are a little bit of spoiler at the Republican picnic. It's like, Dinesh, man, why are you bringing this up? You know, let's not look in the rear view mirror. Let's move on. This is a very powerful sentiment among Republicans, one of the main sources of frustration for me.
That's a little bit wicked, I think, that Republicans would hate Trump so much that they would be willing to usher in somebody like Joe Biden as our commander-in-chief.
Yes, and yet, you know, if you look at the behavior of Republicans, I mean, just look at McConnell, for example. Yep. He has pulled money out of close races. And New Hampshire being a good example, Don Bolduc is running about even with Maggie Hassan. The Republican PAC pulled out $5 million, and they're spending millions of dollars to save Lisa Murkowski when her main opponent is another Republican, Kelly Tshibaka. So you have to ask yourself, why would someone do that? Why would someone who wants to be the Senate Majority Leader be almost acting as if to ensure that he remains the Minority Leader?
Yep. I know our time is tight. Let me just finish with this one question then. Looking at the upcoming midterms, or even looking ahead to 2024, in terms of election integrity, what are you seeing on the horizon?
Well, I think that things have been moving in the right direction. I think the Republicans may have a really great opportunity if they have the House and the Senate to get to the bottom of all this. I mean, this is how you use the power of the legislature to look at problems, to expose them, and to fix them. And so I think this would be a real missed opportunity if Republicans do what they often do. They campaign very well, they sweep into power, then they sit on their hands for a couple of years and do absolutely nothing, and then they've missed their opportunity to really deal with the problem.
Or worse, they start doing Democrats' bidding and start working with Democrats like they so often do.
Exactly.
Dinesh D'Souza, 2000 Mules. They thought we'd never find out. They were wrong. Great title, and it was great speaking with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
There you go. Election integrity, as much as Democrats would like to deny, is still very much a problem in America. And as much as, sadly, Republicans want to keep quiet. Even knowing that, you still have to vote. Get out and vote. I want to thank you for listening. I want to remind you, if you like Bold and Blunt, you can get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at washingtontimes.com, or wherever you get your regular podcasts. Tune in next time. And in the meanwhile, don't forget, stay blunt, stay bold.